Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, to our participants and also to our authors and moderator. We're so excited about this panel. My name is Leslie Hendrickson. I am on the steering committee of the Newburyport Literary Festival, and this is our 19th year. We're so excited. We had a great day in real life in Newburyport yesterday, and then this is our fourth event of the day for our virtual day, and so we're thrilled you're here. Thank you so much. I wanted to give a quick shout out to our sponsors, the Newburyport Bank and the Institute for Savings. These are our founding sponsors. Without them, the festival would not be here. So thank you so much to them. And also the Mass Cultural Council gives us a lot of support, and we appreciate that. I'm going to turn it over to Hannah Harlow, who is also on the steering committee of the Newburyport Literary Festival and is a bookshop owner. She owns the bookshop of Beverly Farms. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you, Leslie. I'm thrilled to be here. We're here to talk about one of the best-selling genres in books right now, YA mysteries and thrillers, and we're here with three terrific authors. So I'm going to introduce the authors. They're going to tell us a little bit about their books. We're going to have a chat. I've got a lot of questions for them, but we'd love to take questions from the audience too, so use that Q&A box. You can put your questions there anytime. We'll probably take them towards the end of the hour. And we'd love to see the comments in the chat too, and we'll chime in if we can, but I hope you all talk to each other, give each other book recommendations, say hello, and shout your enthusiasm. We'd love to hear it. So first up, I'm going to introduce Cynthia Leitich Smith. She is an award-winning best-selling author of books for young readers, and also the author-curator of the native-focused Heart Drum imprint at HarperCollins. She's a citizen of the Muskogee Nation, and we're here to talk about her most recent book, Harvest House, which is behind me, but this is Harvest House. Cynthia, thanks for being here. Can you give us a brief overview of the book and maybe even a little bit about how you came to write it?
Certainly. Mado, thank you so much. A quick shout out to Brett Newton, who is the cover artist for Harvest House. It is the first book published by a national trade press that was both written and illustrated by a woman of Muskogee Nation, which is my own tribal nation. Harvest House is a story of young Huey Wolf. He's a theater kid and he loves it, but alas, there have been cutbacks. So the fall production is out, though the spring is still in. He decides to take that excess energy and volunteer at a local fundraiser haunted funhouse, the kind of place that you would go with your friends on the holiday for a safe, sort of really bigger than life spooky scare. The only catch is it's actually haunted. All this takes place at a crossroads or a small commercial district between a new suburb and an old historic town. So it's very much what kind of bubbles up in the spaces in between. Along the way, Huey has 4 or 5 friends and a large dog that help him. So there is a bit of a nod to the long-standing tradition of friend groups in paranormal mystery, solving puzzles together.
Awesome. It's such a great concept. Next up, we have E.A. Neeves, Emily. Emily grew up in New England, where she spent many summers lifeguarding at an idyllic lake and occasionally catching snapping turtles. She now resides in Salem, Massachusetts with her family. And I read that bio because all of those details are pretty relevant to your debut novel, After You Vanished. So can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Yes. Hi, I'm E.A. Neeves. I wrote After You Vanished, published by Disney Hyperion last late summer, early fall. And After You Vanished tells the story of Teddy, recently graduated from high school, and she has a twin sister who's been missing for about a year when the book starts. And what happened is her sister went to this lake in the middle of the night, allegedly went for a midnight swim, and was never seen again. No body was found. She was a competitive swimmer, so it's a little bit strange, the idea that she would drown in the water, because she is actually like so good. She was invited to the Olympic trials the previous summer. So there's this question that Teddy has, like, how could my sister have drowned? They didn't find her body. Obviously something else happened, but she doesn't know what. And then this summer after she graduates, the young man who was with her sister and is the last known person to have seen her sister on the night she disappeared, starts working as a lifeguard at the same place as Teddy, which is the same lake where her sister vanished. And this kind of kicks off for Teddy this idea that he knows more than he's letting on, and I have to find out what. And of course, as she's trying to find out what, she also develops a bit of a crush and some feelings for this boy, Toby.
Nice, thank you. Jordyn, hi. Jordyn Taylor is an award-winning author of the young adult novels The Paper Girl of Paris, Don't Breathe a Word, and The Revenge Game, which we're going to talk about this afternoon. Formerly executive digital editor at Men's Health magazine, she is also an adjunct professor of journalism at New York University's Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. Thanks for being here. Jordyn, tell us about The Revenge Game.
Thanks so much, Hannah.
Yes.
I am so excited to talk about The Revenge Game, beautifully designed by Casey Moses. So The Revenge Game is a feminist boarding school mystery about a popular lacrosse captain who goes missing on prom night. And it's told from the point of view of his girlfriend, Allison, who is a total hopeless romantic, and she's always dreamed of having the perfect love story. And at the start of the school year, when she's made partners with this popular lacrosse star, Brenton Riggs Jr., and they start to get feelings for each other, she thinks, oh my gosh, I have finally found my fairy tale romance. But as she falls deeper in love with him, she starts to realize there might be a darker side to their seemingly perfect love story. And that's because the boys at their boarding school have started this secret and super toxic competition called the King's Cup to see who has the most sexual prowess. And when the girls at the school find out about the King's Cup, they decide to launch their own rival competition called the Queen's Cup to see who can reject the boys in the most humiliating ways possible. And so, of course, the central question for Allison is her boyfriend Riggs part of the King's Cup, or is he one of the good lax bros? And so this tension builds and builds over the course of the book and erupts on prom night.
Awesome. It's super twisty. And I would say all three of your books are kind of different types of mysteries. So I'd love to talk a little bit first about genre and, what makes a book a mystery? What makes a book YA? Did you set out to write a YA mystery? And basically, maybe the easier question is, what were the stories you wanted to tell, and why did you feel like this was the right venue for telling them? So we can start anywhere. How about Jordyn? Why don't you keep talking about The Revenge Game?
It was very clear to me that this was going to be a young adult story because the ideas that I explore in The Revenge Game are ideas that I started thinking about when I was a teenager. And I think they're really helpful for teenagers to start thinking about now. I mean, when we're in high school, that's often when we start experiencing, like sexual power dynamics between genders. I know I certainly did. But when I was a teenager, I didn't have the terminology to understand some of the things that were happening to me and some of the things that I was witnessing. And so, I thought it would be a very, it felt important to me to write a book that would help give teenage readers the terminology that I wished that I had when I was a teenager.
Cool. Cynthia, what about you? Is it similar? I mean, all three of your books have teen protagonists. I think that's kind of the common theme of YA. But how was it for you? Oh, I think, Cynthia, you're on mute.
Apologies. I would add to the idea of teen protagonists that young adult fiction typically has a page-turning narrative. It is both introspective and also has some external bones to it in a way that is more conducive to mystery and suspense than, say, contemporary realism. And also that YA tends to, however traumatic of pathways it travels, end on a note of hope or empowerment to the young characters and by extension young readers. With regard to Harvest House, the page turning question is whether the ghost is real. If so, who is she? and what happened to her and how can her needs be resolved. The larger question that got me there was really centered around the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and our two-spirit relatives. And I wanted a way to address the current crisis that would be accessible to teens for middle school and high school. A lot of my YA is more that very upper crossover into adult, and I wanted a sort of proper YA story that would give a sense of what is happening and raise awareness and offer a path forward without re-traumatizing, especially Native readers who may have had these experiences. So using the veil of genre, of mystery, and of a paranormal element allows us to look at that at a bit of a slant. We know it's not quite realistic, which gives us some distance, but at the same time, it allows us to think things through in a way that both gets us to where we need to go and also shows us how we can make positive change within that paradigm.
Yeah, I love that. I love that point you made about ending on a note of hope, which I hadn't thought about. That's great. And also, as a bookseller, I thank you because all three of you have given me a range of book recommendations for the YA section, because we do have kids of all ages and adults who are looking in YA, and it's like, well, you got to find what's appropriate for the different, like, a 13-year-old's different than a 17-year-old. Emily, what about you? What story were you trying to tell that made this the right genre for you?
Well, there's a few things that sort of came into play as I was coming up with After You Vanish. One of the large ones, and you mentioned this in my bio, I was a teenage lifeguard. I lifeguarded every summer in high school and in college, and I had this sort of setting and this idea of this summer job that on the face of it is a pretty standard and pretty boring summer job where you're just watching people swim, but in the background there's this like heavy weight of extreme responsibility where these 15 to 22-year-olds are tasked with people's lives, like making sure people stay alive, doing something that can be pretty dangerous for people who don't necessarily know how to swim well. And so that was always in the back of my head as a lifeguard, and it was always something I wanted to explore in writing. And when I eventually came around to this story, mystery was something I had always liked to read myself, and I'd always liked to write suspense. And so I knew I was going to bleed that in. And there's always this, I felt there was this kind of creepiness to the idea that if you're in a particularly open water, a lake or the ocean, and you go under, you can't see what's under the surface. There's a lot under there, but it's inaccessible to our sight. And so there's a kind of scariness to that. And I wanted to play with that concept and play with this idea of these young people kind of balancing, figuring out who they are and this extreme responsibility. So all that kind of comes into play with picking teenage lifeguards as my characters. And I wanted, particularly with Teddy, to show a character who has to, it's a coming of age story, I would say, After You Vanished. She has to, in figuring out what happens to her sister, and through this job and the responsibility she has, come out of her shell. She's an introverted person. Her sister they were twins, but she was the shy one. Her sister was the outgoing one, the talkative one, the confident one. And she has to sort of learn all those things in order to solve her sister's mystery.
Totally. My son just went through lifeguard training, and I will say it is super intense. And he's 15, so terrifying to think you're responsible for these lives.
I started at 15.
Yeah. But you talked about the setting a little bit, and I love that concept about the lake and not knowing what's under the surface. Because I want to talk about the tools you have as writers at your disposal when you're writing these mysteries, to either amp up the tension or to make it creepy. Cynthia's writing a ghost story. How do you make it more ghosty? But so Emily, do you want to say anything else about your setting at the lake?
Yeah, I mean, I use the setting, I would say, a lot. A big part of it, I based the lake, which is called Bottom Rock in the book, on the lake where I lifeguarded, which helped me a lot visually. Like, if you read the book and then you go visit this actual place, which is called Topstone, and it's in Redding, Connecticut, you will see the landscape. It's described similarly. I made it bigger because I needed you to believe there was a chance a body could get lost in that lake. But other than that, it has a very similar feel, and basing it on a real setting that I spent so much time at really helped me get those details in. And I used the setting. Many of the scenes in the book take place at the lake, either during the workday or at night. And I played with the time of day to kind of play with the tension. Some of the more suspenseful scenes, they either happen in the woods, or they happen because the lake is in the middle of the forest, or they happen out in the middle of the lake, or they happen in the dark when it's quieter. You can't necessarily see what's going on. Nobody else is there, very isolated. I used all of that to what I wanted to up the tension and the suspense.
Cool, very effective. Jordyn, tell us about the Adirondacks in winter.
I can.
Yeah.
So the Revenge Game takes place in Lake Placid, New York, which some people might remember as the site of the famous Olympic Games. But it's a mountainous town in the Adirondacks. And I set it there for two reasons. One is simply that I spend a lot of time there. And so I love writing about a place that I know very intimately, because it means that I don't have to conjure details out of my imagination. I really know what it's like to be there. I know what the air smells like and tastes like. I know that, if you're standing at one place in town, I know what you're going to see when you turn to your right, so I set it there because I know it, but I also set it there for the symbolism that I feel like Lake Placid embodies, because it is at once an incredibly beautiful place. In all seasons, you have these amazing mountains covered with trees, and like the foliage is beautiful, and these lakes are stunning, but at the same time, the landscape holds so much danger. Like you have hiking accidents, you have skiing accidents, and so this land is at once so beautiful, but also so dangerous. And so I felt that really captured the tension that Allison experiences in her relationship with Riggs, is that he is seemingly this amazing person, but is there a darker side brewing underneath the surface?
Totally. And then Cynthia, you have the crossroads and you have the haunted house itself. And they were all very spooky. But do you want to talk about that in particular, or any of the other settings in your?
Sure. There's kind of a couple of layers that this functions on. As I mentioned, the crossroads is between a new suburb and a historic town, the kind of place that people go to antique stores and little local restaurants that are rooted in its ethnic history, that kind of a thing. So it very much has this feeling of the past and present. And when we look at the crisis associated with missing and murdered Indigenous women, that has also been going on for hundreds of years. Local folklore has bubbled up saying, oh, there was, and you've heard variations of the story, I'm sure at some point in your life, there was this beautiful, tragic Indian maiden. She loved, she lost, we mourn, and it's all very spooky. And when people use that kind of language and those sort of Hollywood mythologies and that nod to the myth of extinction, they're thinking, oh, this is obviously a maiden of the 1880s, 1890s, perhaps earlier, without most people thinking, or maybe she lived in the 1980s and jammed out to Madonna, or the 1990s or beyond. And so just kind of updating that and playing with some of those ideas, I think gave it a fresher, more timely feel that also spoke to what is of utmost concern today. So that's kind of the more serious level. The more fun aspect of it, at least from a storytelling part, and probably readers too, is that we have this crossroads, and essentially the haunted funhouse is in a chicken restaurant that closed down years ago because of mysterious circumstances, and that gives my theater kid protagonist an opportunity to be part of the design team. So that part of me that always wanted to build my own haunted funhouse got the opportunity to do that fictionally, and not in, it creates more opportunities for humor and levity in any story in which, we're going to be touching on deeper themes. We also want to be sure to portray three-dimensional humanity and a full range of emotion. And that, for me, especially in this book, is going to include, laugh out loud moments. There is a sweet little romance that goes on, and, a loving family with its own eccentricities and antics. So I was able to kind of take all that as a springboard, not only for, mood and suspense and the theater of the cinematic qualities of the book, but also as springboards for character development.
Yeah. Yeah, it is super cinema. I mean, like, you have the decorations of the haunted house as the characters are, building that for Halloween weekend. And then there are Halloween decorations like all over town, and Huey's dad is a big decorator of the house. So you really do a great job of like really setting the scene. And you just mentioned character development, which was sort of my next question of like, I'd really love you to talk about Huey a little bit more, and who he is, and kind of the big question he faces, right, about like standing up for himself at the end of the book. I think you do a great job early on of kind of telling us who he is, just in like this one little fact that in last year's play, he quit because it was an L. Frank Baum production of one of his stories, and Huey discovers that he was incredibly racist and did not want to be involved. And there's a great quote at one point when Huey's talking to his friend Sam, and he says, you're allowed to pick your battles. So could you just bring all those things together and tell us a little about Huey and who he is as a character?
Sure. I mean, Huey is in some ways an every kid. Theater is where he has found a place that he fits in, where he feels really at home. At the same time, he is in some ways groundbreaking in that conversation. There isn't a long tradition of people like him being welcomed into spaces like that. And so he's put in the uncomfortable position of sometimes having to question what everybody else has always taken for granted. In his previous year, he did that. He was researching a mini biography of L. Frank Baum to go on the back of the program for musical production of The Wizard of Oz. He had landed the role of the Tin Man. He was really excited. And then he found that Baum, in fact, had called for the genocide of all Native people shortly before and after Wounded Knee. So very significant, especially since Baum was a newspaper editor and highly influential. What do you do with that information as a kid? And I always want to leave it open to the reader what path they may take, and make it clear that there's not one right decision, and any given character may evolve or change their approach over time. So, Huey has made this decision. It is touched on that other Native kids might make a different one, and he still does go to the play to support his friends who are performing. So there is a lot of nuance to how that conversation takes place. At the same time, he doesn't want to be that kid who always has a problem with something, that kid who is identified first in terms of one identity element and not his whole personhood. And so he's in the situation where the director of the Haunted Funhouse wants to populate it with these ghostly Indian figures that are very Hollywood. Very much the chicken feathers dunked in white. And that is, I would call it red face, except they are dunked in white. So it's a little complicated there. He's not comfortable with it. He's not designing that part of it, the outdoor part of it, where they're springing up from this, haunted Indian graveyard. He's designing the inside part of it. And he wants to be able to make change in a positive way by showing that he can come up with something better. And so this is something he wrestles with throughout, but it also sort of speaks to some of the ideas and stereotypes that have led to the crisis, and also the specific missing person staying that way. People are quick to explain it away because she fit into these sort of tropes that the haunted house director is directly drawing on and arguably perpetuating through this attraction. So he's looking for the better way, and ultimately realizes that he must raise his voice, not only in this context, but in a number of others. So it's a chance really to show how young people can make a difference by putting their own views forth on the stage, on the page, and beyond.
It's awesome. Jordyn, your character, it's totally different, but the similarity is that she kind of learns how to stand up for herself. So it's a different kind of fight, but it's a fight for herself and kind of gaining that confidence of like, she deserves respect and, real love and et cetera, et cetera. But can you tell us a little bit more about Allison and
yeah,
her
first I
travails?
wanted to say, Cynthia, something that really stood out to me about what you were just saying is that, like, I often think the most powerful way to get a message to across is to show and not tell, and it's so easy for us to be instructive and to tell the reader exactly what we want them to take away from the story. But I think that it's so much more impactful. I mean, thinking back to the stories that I read when I was a teenager, it's so much more impactful when I reach that conclusion on my own as the reader. So I think it's awesome that you do that. And I try to do the same thing with my stories too. Yeah, so Allison is she is like she has quite the dichotomy within her, because on the one hand, she's this hopeless romantic who dreams of having this fairy tale love story, like in all the romance novels that she reads, but she's also a little bit maniacal. And so she has this like secret side hustle of basically getting revenge on all of her mom's like crappy ex-boyfriends who treat her terribly. And she refers to it as going into vigilante justice mode. So, she'll go and like egg her mom's ex-boyfriend's house and his car. She messaged another one and like told his partner that he was a cheater. So she has this history of being able to recognize when other women that she cares about are being mistreated by men, but she is incapable of seeing it potentially within her own self. And isn't that so relatable that some of us, we, logically know about we know about feminism and we know about the patriarchy that we live within, but sometimes, and because we're products of that society, it can be so hard to recognize these things when they're happening to us. And so I really tried to have Allison embody that, have somebody who really, really wants and believes in the power of love so much that she is potentially unable to recognize when some darker forces are at play in her own life.
Awesome.
And that's the power of three-dimensionality, right? The deeper we are in that character, we can feel what they're feeling and experience what they're experiencing. We have very low distance between them and us. And that, as you say, generally works so much better than explaining it.
Totally. And from a storytelling perspective, you need tension to get a reader from the beginning to the end of the story. And if from the start of the story, I had Allison be this super jaded, like, ultra like radical person who didn't trust anyone, there would be no story there because she would never get with Riggs to begin with. And so I needed her truly, like, from a narrative construction standpoint, to hold that those multitudes within her.
Yeah. Emily, do you want to chime in about Teddy? I think you had kind of you talked about how it was a coming of age story, but as you were developing Teddy, you kind of had this added challenge of like, it's her twin sister that went missing. So I always thought you really needed to differentiate those two characters, which you did such a good job of.
Yeah, I mean, and after you vanished, even though Izzy, the missing twin, she gets it's first person Teddy, and she's talking to her sister. So the narrative structure is I to you. She uses you a lot, and you was always her sister Izzy. She's like telling her sister a story of what happened after she disappeared. And Izzy gets very little page time as a character on the page because she's missing. But I did try to really like show who she was and her in contrast to Teddy. And the distinction I made to do this was to have them just be, I mean, they're identical twins. There are characters who make comments about, how much they look alike and having trouble telling them apart. But personality wise, they were kind of on opposite sides of the spectrum, where Izzy was athletic and confident. She knew exactly what she wanted and how to go for it. Maybe even to the point of it being like more arrogance than confidence. Whereas Teddy is meeker. She just kind of flies under the radar, wallflower type, doesn't want to get involved in conflict, loves her sister, but lets her sister have the limelight. And and in some ways kind of gives up things she might want because her family becomes so focused on getting her sister to the Olympics. And there's a few things that Teddy mentions having sacrificed, kind of to this end. And she's not resentful about it, but it's just kind of there. So I was trying to show this contrast, and with now her sister, who was always the one in the limelight, is the one who's gone. Now Teddy has to kind of figure out who she's going to be without this person who she loves so much, but who she let take all the attention, whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. Now all the attention is on her, and she has to kind of learn to deal with that.
Yeah. So we've talked about, setting and character development. Are there any other tools any of you want to chime in about of how you create tension or anything kind of specific to mystery? Or like, do you play, like, how do you write a twist or a cliffhanging chapter? I don't like, if anyone wants to chime in on any of those things. Yeah.
I have one thing that I try to do, and this takes multiple drafts to get to this point, but I try to have each chapter more or less answer a question and ask a new one. So like, as you're going through the mystery, and you've got the big question, which in my book is what happened to Izzy, but you have these like smaller questions along the way where she learns something and it's like, okay, well, I now need to figure out this, and that will get me closer to the big question. And each time she gets a little clue, it also introduces a new question. And some of those questions lead her in the wrong direction. But it's this kind of like domino effect of A leads to B, which opens up now question C, and then you answer B, and that opens up question D. And like each time you learn something new, you also have a new thing you have to learn, kind of action. And that's what I use to keep the story moving forward in the mystery aspect. And one of the things I did as I was writing it, and I was much further along in the drafting process, was I looked at each chapter and I literally wrote down, in this chapter, we solve X and we learn that we need to know Y. And like, I made sure that there was something we were gaining moving the story forward. We got a new clue in each moment. And if I found it too big of a space where there was no new clue, then I knew I either had to add something there or shorten that section because we had gone too long without learning anything new about the mystery.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense to me. Cynthia or Jordyn, do you have anything you want to add?
I was going to add that something that I employ in all of my novels is jumping around between timelines and between different characters' perspectives. In the Revenge Game, I jump around in time. And so, and I can even show you in my copy that I have here. Yes. When the story starts, it doesn't open at the beginning of the school year. It opens at the end of the school year after prom night with a news article about Riggs's mysterious disappearance on prom night. The same night that a deadly blizzard swept through the Adirondack region. And it's only once we know that this popular lacrosse star has gone missing on prom night that we go back to the beginning of the school year and learn about what happened leading up to his disappearance. And if I hadn't started with that news article, we would have begun the story at the beginning of the school year with wide-eyed Allison falling in love, and it could have potentially read as a romance novel. And I wanted to signal to the reader that this is a much darker book than that, and this is a mystery. The central question is what happened to Riggs. And so I used those, jumping around in time moments to help convey the genre of mystery and really like ramp up the tension for the reader and make them really want to figure out like the answer to that central question.
Cool. I mean, you had two, right? The central question of what happened to Riggs, but also like how true is Allison and Riggs's relationship? Mm-hmm. So those were like two big questions you're balancing. Yeah. Cynthia, how about you?
First, I love what you're saying about reader expectations. I think that is really important. And I likewise use some quasi-epistolary techniques like newspaper articles and advertising so that you could both set some parameters of to what's happening, but also it gives you an opportunity to get some of that exposition-y information out there without it weighing down the forward moving narrative, which I think is really important. I definitely think, the technique of talking to someone who isn't there is really interesting, because there is a different way that we talk to each of the people in our lives that says so much about who they are, who we are, what the connection is, how it's evolved over time, and where that relationship might be going. With Harvest House, one of the techniques that I used was to employ an alternating point of view, first person from the perspective of Celeste, the ghost, and third person centered on Huey and his friends. So it's really with the ghost that we get the most intimate thoughts and feelings. At the same time, she is an unreliable narrator. She has gaps in memory, and she too has a lot of questions about how she came to be, what her purpose is there, and how to resolve the situation. So it's sort of like a set of Russian doll mystery questions, where one is within the other, is within the other, and so on all the way down.
Awesome, thank you. We are getting some questions from the audience, so we're going to take those in a few minutes, and people should feel free to chime in with more if they have them. And I also know people want to know about process, but I have one last question before we get to that, and that is about romance. Because you all have some romance in your book. There's a romantic interest for all of your protagonists. So do you feel any pressure when you're writing YA to have romance, or at least to have that as a storyline, or does that just work for these particular stories?
I didn't feel pressure, and I don't think that a story needs a romantic plotline. It's personally what I like to write about, and it's what I like to read about. So I chose to have that be a central element of the story. But no, I wouldn't say that I felt pressure.
Cool.
Yeah, I would say my answer is pretty similar to Jordyn's. Like, I mean, this is my first novel, so I didn't have any pressure coming on me. I was writing what I wanted to write, and then afterwards I got an agent and published it. But I like reading books with romance. I like writing romance. And so for me personally, I will probably always include it. But there are definitely readers and writers who feel the opposite, and there's room for both. I don't think YA necessarily has to have romance. I think it does lend itself towards at least a small romantic subplot, because when you're a teenager, that's when you're first figuring out whether you want romance in your life and how important it is to you. And so a lot of teenagers, to varying degrees, are thinking about dating and whether they want to date, who they want to date, what they're looking for in a romantic relationship or partnership. And it's like the first time that this becomes potentially important to a lot of people. So it does lend itself to that. And also, they don't know how to have romantic relationships yet. They're figuring it out, which is great fodder for a lot of tension. It's much easier to have your teenage couple miscommunicating. It's more believable because they're still learning.
Totally.
I would simply add to that, that no, while it's not necessary, there is an opportunity here. In the case of Harvest House, there is a parallel romantic construct between past and present, which further connects the characters and heightens the climax for reasons. Read it and find out. But beyond that, even though it's often said that romance is overrepresented in young adult literature, I agree that it is so much a part of daily life for so many young people. It certainly isn't overrepresented when it comes to depictions of Native teens. I think this is my 11th or 12th book, and it's the first one that I've written that has two Native teenagers in a romantic connection. And, beyond that, as, was just stated, awkwardness abounds. And if you are needing to balance out some of these more serious themes, it does lend itself naturally to very relatable humor and a different level of suspense that isn't quite so fraught for the emotional state of the young reader.
Great point. Let's talk a little bit about how you write. And I think a big question for mysteries is, do you know the ending before you start? So that's the common question of, you are a plotter or a pantser, which, will hopefully the audience knows what we're talking about. So maybe you could tell us about how you set out to write your novels. Jordyn, why don't you start us out?
Hardcore plotter over here. I
Nice.
actually, the idea that sparked this book was the answer to the question. And I don't want to reveal what it was because that will spoil the book for
Don't tell
anyone who
us.
hasn't
Yeah.
read it yet. But I did know exactly how this book was going to end. And so that was my starting point. And yeah, I plotted it all out from there. I map it all out before I get started. Usually I start by making notes by hand in a notebook where I divide the page up. I use this like 4-act system that like I invented, but I invented for myself, but it definitely is paralleled in like a million other books out there. So I do it by hand. I break my page up into 4 acts where the inciting incident is in the first act. By the end of the second act, we're at that like low dark night of the soul moment. The climax is at the end of the third act, and then the resolution is in the 4th act. So I map it all out like that. And then I usually write a synopsis that's like 2,000 to 3,000 words where I explain the entire story written out in sentence form, start to finish. And then once I get the sign off on that from my agent and my editor, that's when I start drafting. And I always draft from beginning to end. I find it really hard to jump around. That's just the way that my brain works. I need to feel like I always think of writing like I'm building a house. And I need to feel like the foundation is really stable before I'm able to like build the next floor. You can probably tell I've never actually built a house, but like before I build the next floor or whatever comes next in the house building process, I really need to feel like the foundation is really stable.
So, Cynthia, you've written a lot of books. Do you know the ending, and has your process evolved over time?
My process has evolved over time. For a long time, I would write a complete draft of the manuscript with a beginning, middle, and end, say 50 to 80,000 words, print it, read it, toss it, and delete the file and start over. And that initial draft was really for me to get to know the characters, get to know the world, have some sense of what the central question was. And from there, I'd write myself a very long letter. I now start more with the very long letter, I think, because I have the added time constraints of being an author curator. Being a full-time author is really being 5 or 6 different people at once. So sometimes those people get in the way of my creative time, and a lot of it happens subconsciously. And so I'll start now with that sort of messy letter, and I'll have a watercolor idea of where the story is going, not really a fine oil idea of where it's going. I want as much as possible. This is my first proper mystery. I've definitely done books with suspense elements, but this required more structure. I had to figure out what the answer is, where we were going to, sort of, then all the questions that needed to be answered to get there. And by answering those questions, the little ones along the way, I was able to answer the bigger one along with my characters. And the book did still surprise me on certain levels up and through the revisions that went to the editor.
That's
Cynthia, you
amazing.
deleted the
I know.
files.
I have done it several times. And
Wow.
okay, so it sounds foolish or courageous, depending on your point of view. But if you think about it, if nobody else is going to read it ever, it takes a lot of pressure off. So it doesn't matter what it looks like. My instinct would have been to spin on those first 30 pages forever. That may not even end up in the final book, which would really start on page 75, which I would find out if I had written the whole thing to the extent that it was in my brain. With more experience, I'm able to get farther faster, but honestly, I don't regret any of that time. It was all really helpful to my apprenticeship, and it was fun. It was joyful.
That's so cool. Emily, how about you?
So I never really felt like a pantser or plotter, but like somewhere kind of right smack in the middle. Every novel length story I've written, and like a lot of writers, I wrote novel length stories before I got one published. I did know the ending generally before I started writing, and I knew like 2 or 3 or 4 major plot points that I wanted to hit, getting from beginning to end. But I didn't, and I never have just like very detailedly plotted out everything I wanted to write. I do like just kind of jumping in and letting the story take me places, coming up with stuff as I go along. changing the outline a little bit. There are twists in After You Vanish that I did not know until I was like typing. I was like, oh my God, this would be so cool. And I just sort of went with it. Sometimes you do something like that, and then when you read it in the draft, you realize it's not working, and the thing you thought was so cool, you have to take out. But sometimes I have had this just sort of like moment of inspiration while I was writing with an idea that ended up staying in the book, and being one of my preferred parts of it. So I definitely have this kind of balance between having a general outline and then pantsing my way through the general outline for the first draft. When I do a second draft, that's when I like make a very detailed outline. Like, here's all my chapters, here's all the stuff that happens. This is where I still need to, you know, add in things that should happen but aren't on the page, or things that are on the page that shouldn't be on the page anymore, or I should reorder here and there. And that's when I get my like very detailed plotting done, is in like draft 2.
Cool. It sounds like you have a lot of drafts, or no? Like,
Usually I would say like 2 major drafts. Like draft 2 is major revisions to draft 1, and then from there, we're looking at more like what I would call minor. Like the plot and the character development is usually for me finalized by the end of the second draft, and now I'm cleaning up sentences, adding a few details where something feels thin, removing details where I've been too verbose. You know, just like cleaning up and streamlining everything, but not really changing the structure of the story anymore.
yeah, that makes sense. I want to make sure we get to some of the audience's questions. So let's take one from Charlotte, who would like to know all of your paths to publication. So how did you first get published? Cynthia, why don't you start us out?
It was the Cretaceous period. Dinosaurs walked the earth. I was published, actually, I was one of the first Gen Xers, and my first book came out in 2000. Back then, there were only 4 or 5 literary agents who specialized in authors of books for young readers. And I was on a listserv that mentioned that a particular editor was looking for stories that sounded like mine. So we were able to send directly, and I think it was on my 4th or 5th submission to her that she signed my first book. Throughout my career, I've only really worked with HarperCollins and Candlewick Press for the most part, with the odd project here and there, like short stories or poems or whatever. So I have been really very blessed across my publishing journey.
Nice. Jordyn, how about you?
My publishing journey actually started with recaps of The Bachelor, believe it or not.
That's awesome.
When I graduated college, I had my first job as a journalist at a newspaper called the New York Observer, where I was writing about reality TV and recapping The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, and the recaps that I was writing, they became really popular online. And an agent who was also a friend from college reached out to me, and she said, I love your Bachelor recaps and I love your voice, and I was wondering if you would ever be interested in writing a book. And writing a book had been my lifelong dream. But because I'm from Canada and I needed a work visa to stay in the US, I hadn't even thought about like pursuing an artistic career on the side. Like, I was so focused on finding my full-time career, getting my visa sponsorship. So this was like a sign from the universe that I could finally pursue this thing that I had dreamed of my whole life. So I started working with her on a mystery. It was a murder mystery that took place on the set of a reality TV dating show. Perfect. And that book, we came very close to getting a deal on it, but it didn't sell. And then I wrote another novel that also came close to getting a deal, but didn't sell. And I was at a crossroads trying to figure out, like, what is my next move? I really want this to happen. And that's when we heard that an editor at HarperCollins was looking for an author to write a young adult novel about the French Resistance in World War II. And I had been a history major in college, and it just sounded like the perfect project for me. So I auditioned for them to write this book and pitched them what I could do with this idea that they had. And they made me an offer, and that's the book that ended up becoming my debut, The Paper Girl of Paris. And so that's how I first became published. So yeah, my first book that I had published was not the first book that I wrote. I think that's so important to,
It's so important.
yeah, to say to anyone on this call who is looking at a career in publishing. I had to go through so many rejections to finally find the path and the book that was going to be the one that worked for me. And truly, every one of those drafts, every one of those rejections taught me something, and I just kept going. And it did finally work, but it took years, and it took a lot of books. So
I think it's super important too, because I think a lot of people think, oh, once you get an agent, you're fine, you're going to be
oh
all
my gosh,
set.
no, I mean, that was like a really important step, but I was not set at all. And after working with my agent for a few years, I still worried that it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, good for you for keep going. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it wasn't even my first agent. I'm with my second agent now. My first book that I got an agent for was my graduate thesis at my MFA program, and a professor in my program linked me up with the person who was an assistant to his agent, and she was starting to acquire her own clients at that time. And it was a collection of linked short stories, and I signed with her. She tried to sell it for a couple of years. We got a lot of projections that were of the line of, this is beautiful writing, but I can't sell short stories. And eventually I wanted to move on to writing this YA book, and she wasn't as interested in, because I was doing like literary short stories, and that was just not, YA mystery was not her thing. So we parted ways, and I was agentless, writing the book I wanted to write, finished it, went back to the query trenches, sending out query letters to agents trying to find someone, and eventually found the agent who I'm with now at Writer's House, Beth, and she loved my book. I signed with her, and after about 1.5 years of her sending it around, Disney liked it and made an offer, and it was published at the end of August in 2023, so about 9 months ago.
Wow. So perseverance is the lesson. Let's get to some more questions. So Irene is asking about how you do research for your mysteries. Did you feel like any of your books required research? Do all your books require research? And how do you do it?
Well, Google is my friend. I actually have this like little series I do once a week on my Instagram where I just post all the things that I Googled that week while I was writing. And a lot of them are very minor things. I'm Googling a synonym for something because my brain was blanking and I didn't want to use that word, but I wanted a similar word. Or I'm Googling some tiny little detail. It's just so I can get some of the background stuff right. But I also, if I need to deal with some larger topic, it starts with Google, but then I'm looking at particular websites. Like one of the things with mysteries is if there's ever any legal stuff you need to know about the laws of where your story is set, or the way the police might handle something. I've spent time on government websites, reading through legal documents, trying to figure out like enough so that I'm not contradicting reality. It's fiction, so I don't feel like I need to be totally 100% accurate. I'm not writing a legal thriller, but I want the details to be believable and true enough that I can tell the story I want to tell in a contemporary kind of landscape. So I will, if something like that comes up, spend an afternoon looking at the state of Massachusetts laws about such and such.
Thanks. Cynthia, Jordyn, you want to add anything, or we can go on to the next question?
I'll just say quickly, with mine, other than small questions, probably the most notable was the research I did for the building and running of a haunted funhouse. I did interviews with workers from the one at Worlds of Fun in Kansas City. It was probably the biggest, and other smaller outfits. And it was fodder for, what do you find left over the next day? And what sorts of hijinks do both the staff and the customers engage in? What are the risks? What are the injuries? What can go wrong with the various special effects? There's really a lot to it behind the scenes. And in some ways it was a question, how much is going to be paranormal and how much of it is going to be human hijinks.
And for my research, I'm very lucky that my husband's actually a detective. So I often go to him when I'm writing my mysteries and say, I needed this character to have disappeared. I need the law enforcement to, not be able to solve it right away. What the heck could have happened? And so he really helps me plot out some of the details that make the story believable from a legal perspective, which is super useful. But in terms of the more fun details in my story, I put out a poll on social media when I was first starting to come up with the idea for the revenge game, and I asked people, what were at your school or camp growing up, were there competitions for sexual prowess that you remember? Because I remembered going to sleepover camp and there being these competitions where people would make lists of all the people that they wanted to hook up with that summer, and they would mark them off on the list. And so I put this question out there saying, what went on at your schools or where you grew up? And somebody told me about a competition at a friend's school where people got points for different sexual acts that they completed with other people. And so doing that sort of crowdsourced research helped me build some of the details for the revenge game. And then I also had to do research into weather patterns in the Adirondack region, because that plays a big role in Riggs's disappearance.
Totally. It is blowing my mind that your husband's a detective. So great.
It's very useful.
Very useful. Okay, let's get to James's. We have like 2 minutes, but let's get to James's question about what is the threshold for a YA book to become dark YA in the mystery or horror genre? Do you guys have thoughts on that? It's probably, I'm sure it's a big gray area.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about what the answer is.
The tough one.
Does anyone actually know the answer? Like actually?
I mean, I don't know that there is one. I think it's probably a marketing choice. This comes from having worked in publishing for like 10 years. I worked for Houghton Mifflin Harcourt and then for HarperCollins on the production side. And I don't know for sure, but I would guess that their marketing people are deciding do we think this will sell better if we market it as darker? And there's a lot of factors that are going into that, some of which might not necessarily have to do with your book as much as what else is popular right now and what other books are coming out around the same time, and all these sorts of factors that are going to play into how the marketing plan for your book. And so I don't think there's likely a hard and fast rule of this is, dark YA.
That's a great answer. Thank you for that. Thank you for all of your answers today. Thank you for the books that you wrote. I hope everyone listening goes out and buys them and reads them and tells all their friends about them. So thanks everyone for being here. I had a great time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes.
More thanks from me. And we have one more session today, also with the great Hannah Harlow.
Please join, 3:30.
Yep, it starts at 3:30 with Jamie Attenberg and Steve Ullman to talk a little bit about the writing process. We started our day with a workshop with the gateless method to write a little bit, and now we're going to hear some more about process as sort of a bookend to the absolute end of our festival. It'll be our last session for this year. So hope to see you there. Again, thank you, Emily, Cynthia, and Jordyn, and of course, Hannah, and to all our participants. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.